Hello and welcome to Generous Theology. I'm Brock, and I'm with my friend Chuck, and we have the opportunity to be in Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 1, Prolegomena. We're just starting to go through Part 5, Bavinck's section on faith, and we're in Chapter 15. And Chuck, this is one of the crown jewels of Reformed theology, because it's one of the areas that non-believers find the most difficult to navigate. And so while there are biblical scholars who are not Christian, the biblical scholarship that they bring is rarely balanced, and it is often seriously deficient. A biblical scholar who's not a believer may in fact have some insight into some particular specialty within the field. Maybe linguistics, maybe it's archaeology, maybe it's some other area. But non-believers really struggle with the role of faith in theology, and this makes Christianity, let me rephrase this makes any kind of Christian inquiry that's not made from this foundational principle of faith, in some sense, not Christian. And I want to say that in a generous way, to not dismiss legitimate scholarship where it is. But Chuck, I've noticed that really non-believers just have troubles with even some of the basics of the Christian faith. I remember I was reading, growing up, I was reading a book, Isaac Asimov, on the Bible. And it was a commentary on the scriptures. What more could you want? A commentary on the Bible from a very intellectually bright, enlightened, secular thinker. And when I got that book as a teenager, I was a bit worried, not in the sense that I thought I would lose my faith, but in the sense that Asimov's writing represented an intellectual challenge. And I started reading his commentary, and I immediately was in this position where I was like, are we reading the same text? Are the things he's talking about even in the same universe of things that I know to be true from my own Christian testimony? Now, Chuck, I wasn't saying that as a teenager I was smarter or more intellectual than Isaac Asimov. Far from it. But I think the one thing I had that he didn't was faith. And there's really something about this master key coming together and centering the entire Christian faith around this internal principle of God's Holy Spirit ministering to your heart and to my heart as believers through our faith, leading us into knowledge. And then we have that famous saying, faith seeking understanding, from the Middle Ages, such a blessing to us. But my point is this, Chuck, we're in a really special place, and going through Professor Bavinck is going to be especially helpful, I hope, in this regard. And I just wanted to preface our discussion with that. As we get into the meatier parts here in Chapter 15, how do you see Professor Bavinck laying things out and maybe giving us the tools that we need to try to speak to those who find faith such a difficult topic?
Especially in this chapter, in discussing faith, we began, as we talked about last week a little bit, just talking about, some of the issues around how do we receive revelation and what does it mean to have faith, and how do we deal with that issue of faith with people who don't have faith. And we recognize that to some extent there is a level at which we have to admit we can't deal with that very well, that there is a difference between a person who has faith and one who doesn't in how we can even talk about this idea of faith. Recognizing that, however, I think what Bavinck does next, I think is really helpful at a couple of different levels. And what he does is he goes through a series of methods, theological methods, that theologians, philosophers, that people in that intersection between theology and philosophy have used to deal with this concept of faith. And realistically, these methods are about more than just studying faith. They're really methods of studying theology and studying dogmas. But he uses, I think, this discussion of faith in the theological method, to just deal with these methods, because I think in the end, it is that discussion of faith and what it is and what it means and how it relates to belief and how it relates to, feeling, that concept of faith really ties well into those things and provides really a great base to look at these various methods, even though these methods can be applied to other, concepts within theological study. This is a good place to do that. The other thing that he does is he looks at these methods and places them to some extent historically in, first of all, the milieu that they come out of. And so who are the philosophers, who are the theologians, and why these methods, may have at particular times come to, more use, or why those methods, were particularly popular among certain folks at certain times. And in all cases, he's frank about both the strengths and the weaknesses of these methods for doing theology, and specifically for studying this idea of faith. And one of the things that I appreciate about Bavinck is that he doesn't do what I think we're sometimes tempted to do, is say, okay, there's one perfect way to do things, and all the other ones are terrible. And so here's why my idea of the right way to do things is the right way, and here's why all the rest of them are terrible. That's not what Bavinck does. He acknowledges that there are strengths and weaknesses to all of these methods that are created by humans, and often are in reaction to some of the weaknesses of the other methods. And so he points out, some of the strengths of these methods, but also where they can have some weaknesses. Now, I would say that there may be some who would read this chapter, and especially if you don't move on into the next chapters, which eventually we will, but there might be some who read this chapter who might be frustrated, because in this chapter, at least, Bavinck never really goes down the path of this is the right way. He does give, I think, some particular attention to the historical apologetic method as being maybe a traditional method that has some strengths, as long as we avoid some of their weaknesses. And I think he also talks about some of the other methods in ways where, where there can be some benefit in coming from those. But he never really comes to an answer that says, okay, here is how we're going to think about faith. Here's how we're going to think about theology. This is the method we're going to use to do theology. And that might be frustrating to some people. On the other hand, I think it's also a recognition that there can be some benefit in looking at things in different ways, and that there can be also danger in limiting ourselves to only one perspective at looking at these things, especially from the human perspective, from the perspective of our trying to create a method from our human imperfection that can describe something that really is beyond, human creation, beyond complete human understanding, but is something that comes from God, right? Faith is a gift from God. And in some ways, faith is in some ways, at least in some aspects, beyond our human comprehension. And especially in those circumstances, there is some benefit from using multiple methods to look at faith and to study it and to try to determine, what method do we use for understanding it and explaining it. And then I think the last thing I would say about this section is that while ostensibly this is a chapter about faith and how the theological methods can help us to understand faith, Bavinck does such a good job of picking out various issues that arise as a result of these methods and things that we need to think about and are important even today. And in the discussion on the ethical psychological method, there's a lot of discussion about how this idea of a search for a unity between believing and knowing is something that really is something that I think people are, at least thinkers, are really trying to figure out. In the section that he writes on the religious empirical method, he spends a great deal of time talking about experience and certainty, and how does experience and our individual experiences, how does that play into our understanding of faith? And he recognizes that there is a place for experience and for feeling, as Schleiermacher describes it, but that place is not at the head of the class, for example. And in the same way that in the more more rational methods, we don't, there's something to be said about doing rational thinking about things, but that's not necessarily the be all and end all either. So that, each of these methods brings up various issues that I think are worthwhile to be thinking about, and in some ways seem, they're side issues to just the concept of faith, but on the other hand, they're really key issues that have a bearing on what do we mean when we study theology, and what do we mean when we study faith, and how do we describe it, and what is it, and so this is a really deep section. In fact, I'll admit, there are entire pages here where I just have question marks because I'm not quite sure exactly where he's going in some of these descriptions of some of these methods. I just don't know, I don't have as good of a grasp on some of these philosophers to understand exactly what Bavinck is dealing with. I found that, especially in the religious empirical method, that there was just so much there that seemed to be almost over my head. On the other hand, there's also much there that I think we can get a great deal out of. And it is my sense, even when it goes over my head, that what Bavinck really is doing here is really trying to engage with key philosophical methods and key schools of philosophy, and trying to engage with them in light of how do we do theology and how do we think about faith in ways that are really quite important. Now, I'm wondering, I know you have, at least when it comes to philosophical schools, you've got a little bit more, deeper knowledge and education on some of these things. And I'm wondering, first of all, did you get that same sense from Bavinck, that what he was doing was engaging these methods not merely as a way of talking about faith, but really getting at some of the key ideas in these various methods and how they connect to the philosophy of the day? And then second of all, I'm interested in, what did you think, especially looking at this from 100 years on, or almost 100 years on in some cases, do you think that Bavinck had a good sense of the philosophical issues, and do you think he responded to them appropriately?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking that and building the issues out so well. So I think, to maybe start us down a path, it's maybe worth considering what's at stake and what the expectations are. And so we're in a chapter about faith, and perhaps you've heard the expression that I've heard several times over my life, and that is, the Bible is a public book in that it is open to everyone, and everyone and anyone should read it. But at the exact same time, the Bible is a private book for believers, because, and in the sense that the kind of knowledge that God wishes to communicate and convey to believers is not the kind of knowledge that non-believers are going to arrive at in their normal course of study. So what's the traditional idea? Well, the Bible ought to be like my university physics book. It should be well written. There should be examples in it that allow me to follow. There should be clear pedagogical ideas illustrated in the text that helps me, the student, understand that the world around me is a certain way and isn't other ways. And so there's this approach. Now, if humankind is neutral, if humankind is morally able to receive divine truth, then this approach could be successful. But what you and I understand, Chuck, from our Augustinian history is that the Bible reveals to us that we are so far from God that there is a change in our wills. There is a bondage that our sinful wills have put us in a predicament. And that bondage is that a principle of moral enmity exists inside of us. And so because of that, without God's additional aid, without God's grace, we, in our sinful search for truth, will find ourselves hindered. We'll find ourselves thwarted. We will not come. to divine truth. We will not because we cannot. And we cannot because we are ultimately at war with the one who's bringing this truth. Now, it's in that backdrop, that moral irreconcilability between God and man, that we can find the ultimate reason for why a non-believer can't just pick up the Bible like he picks up his physics text, study it for a little bit, and then know, as he knows physics, know theology. And so, having said that, we don't mean to negate the scriptures. We just merely wish to point out that unless we're aware of this own limitation in our own sinful creatureliness, if we don't understand that limitation, then we will very likely be often asking the question, well, why can't anybody just pick up the Bible, read it, and understand it the way you can do a chemistry book or a physics book? So Bavinck, what he does here with these different methods is he outlines, I think, 4 different major schools or approaches that people took when it came to thinking about how do we receive the text and come to faith in the text and then proclaim it. And so this first method, this historical apologetic method, really appeals to this university physics idea. And so in that sense, the apologist is in some sense like the professor of Christianity, and he's appealing to his audience, and he's giving proofs, he's making arguments, he's rationally considering Christian ideas in a moral context. And in some sense, we have this marketplace of ideas. So the apologist goes down to the local temple where philosophical topics are discussed, and people at the temple are engaging in this marketplace of ideas, and the Christian inserts himself, and then pretty soon he wins over his audience by using superior techniques, better arguments, analytic models and methods, reasoning, rationality. And there is some truth to this. Bavinck notes in his section that there is a sense in which apologetics, the defense of the Christian truth, is a true philosophy, and it is a practical blessing. Now, Professor Bavinck talks about this. He says, in defense of Christian truth, the apologists do not start from a base of doubt or neutrality, but from a position of firm belief and unshakable conviction. Harnack has highlighted the high-minded, spirited, self-conscious, which in that early period sustained Christians in their struggle against Jewish and pagan science. Now, this is Harnack. So Bavinck is citing and quoting Harnack, who is talking about what it was like for early Christians to engage in this marketplace of ideas with Jewish and pagan science. And here's what Harnack has to say. We have been rescued from darkness and lifted into the light. This was the chant that rose from Christians during those early centuries. It was intellectual truth and lucidity in which they reveled and gloried. Polytheism seemed to them an oppressive night. Now that it was lifted off of them, the sun shone clearly in the sky. Wherever they looked, everything became clear and sure in the light of spiritual monotheism, owing to the living God. They gaze at nature only to rejoice in the order and unity of its movement. Heaven and earth are a witness to them of God's omnipotence and unity. They ponder the capacity and endowments of human nature and trace in them the Creator. In human reason and liberty, they extol his boundless goodness. They compare the revelations and the will of God with this reason and freedom. And lo, there is entire harmony between them. They look at Christ and scales fall, as it were, from their eye. Lastly, they contemplate the course of history, its beginning, middle, and end, only to find a common purpose everywhere, which is in harmony with the glorious origin and a still more glorious conclusion. Now, Chuck, that was a really stirring passage. But at the base of it, Harnack is saying that Christianity struck out. Let me rephrase. Christianity reached out in the marketplace of ideas, and with superior ideas that were inspired by a superior worldview, a superior clarity and understanding of the way things are. Christian apologists reached out and won in the marketplace of ideas with Jewish thinkers and pagan philosophers. Now, this sets the stage. By the way, nothing wrong with this. And we're not rebuking it in the sense that we're saying Christianity ought to not win in the marketplace of ideas. But interestingly, Chuck, when you look at the challenges of modernity today, and here I think of, in particular, secular challenges to Christianity, we don't find the same level of argumentation brought by secularists against Christianity that the apologists found in those early centuries. And so what I think I'm trying to say is I think other non-Christian worldviews have upped their game in response to Christianity. And today, if you look at it from a marketplace of ideas, Christianity might be simply one among many. And that is an interesting historical development. I don't know many people who think in maybe the 120 years since Bavinck wrote this, I don't know many people who think that Christian scholarship has by and large been leading in the West. In fact, possibly more people think otherwise. And so with that in mind, this historical apologetic method, Christianity isn't just about winning in the marketplace of ideas. It's not simply about being, Chuck, you go to Buddhist Motors and I go to polytheist Motors, and then you and I both go to Christian Motors and we find that their vehicle is better. And so we joyfully embrace it as the market leader and then move forward with that. But I think the issues associated with the historical apologetic method means that the marketplace of ideas is not all that's going on. And that's the first of the schools that we're going to talk about. So let me pause there, Chuck, and maybe ask you to reflect on that. And how does that strike you? And where does Christianity situate itself today with respect to this marketplace of ideas?
First of all, I think you did a nice job of giving an overview of this historical apologetic method and both some of the strengths of it and some of the weaknesses of it. I would say, first of all, that, there is a sense in which a lot of Christians still look to this method. And I think we do it for a couple of reasons. And I think these reasons are perfectly good reasons, but they also might express when and where this method is more useful and when and where it may be less. As you pointed out, this really was historically the method that was used for much of the era of Christendom. And therefore it had a great impact, right? It began as a method that was used for Christians to say, hey, here's what we believe, and this is why it's reasonable. And in a world where, Christianity initially was just seen as this crazy cult of cannibals or, orgiastic love feasts because people didn't understand what was actually happening, there was a need for sort of a rational discussion of, no, this is what we believe, and this is why it's a good belief. And let me explain to you what's actually happening here. We're not cannibals. We're not participating in orgiastic love feasts. The Christianity is something that's very different. And it had a great deal of effect and impact, especially against some of the old pagan religions. And so there is a sense in which I think we as Christians, having known that worked in certain circumstances, want to go back to that way of thinking. And by the way, I don't think that's, recognizing that there are some flaws here. And you've talked about the fact that in many ways, non-Christian religions have upped their game. That is true. But there's also a sense in which that in a certain in a certain part of in certain circles of the world, shall we say, there is still a sense in which Christians have this need and there is benefit to just doing apology, to explaining what it is that we believe and defending our faith. And frankly, I think there is a sense in which, we've talked about that now that we're moving out of a world where, at least in the Western world, Christianity was almost assumed, moving into a world where perhaps the opposite has happened, and Christianity once again is looked down upon and not necessarily a part of the general world around. There may be again a need to do apology, and this method may have some benefits in that regard. And so I think of, there are apologists who do this. There's that book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and there's been some follow-up books to that. I think that book and other apologists who follow that method are using this method to defend what it is that Christian views are, and point out how they actually can work well and how rational they are, that this is not just something that it's not like the Church of the Babalulu Kumiaye or something where it's just what's going on, or this flying spaghetti monster or something. This is something that has some heft to it, and you can talk about it in an academic way. So that's a strength there, and I think that's a strength we're going to want to probably use again in the future. But there then comes, we do come to this problem that Bavinck has identified, that when we use this historical apologetic method, we can have a tendency, because we are fallen humans who do not do things perfectly, and sin affects the way we think, and causes even the best sometimes of our intentions to fall short, that we run into some of the concerns of what Bavinck describes turning the truth of faith into the content of reason, and creating a division between natural and supernatural truths, a division that has a detrimental effect on both. And I think there is a sense that both in terms of Roman Catholic apologetics, but perhaps even in Protestant apologetics, when we rely solely on this method, in many ways what we do is we almost idolize reason. We almost idolize our minds and our ability to think through things, and we forget that the fall affected our minds as well as our bodies, and so it affected our ability to think rationally through things, and that the fall has affected that as well. And so we can run into some of the issues that Bavinck describes about this method. But I think Bavinck would also agree that this method has some great uses, and it is something that, perhaps during the 19th century, perhaps even during Bavinck's time, the use of the historic apologetic method in the marketplace of ideas perhaps was not as useful in that marketplace. I do wonder, though, whether that will always be that way, and I think there's still, while it probably has more benefit in a less academic marketplace, I think there is a sense in which this historical apologetic method, that points out some of the rational benefits of Christianity and some of the things that really make sense about Christianity, as long as we don't see that as the be-all and end-all, as long as we don't still rely on the Word as revealed to us and the Holy Spirit as He uncovers that for us. As long as we don't forget about those things being primary, I think using this method in certain circumstances can be of great benefit.
So true, Chuck. I think we see the idea of upping of the game of Christianity in these four schools as Christianity has had to respond to the challenges each of the four presented. And so with that in mind, let's talk about this second method, this second series of conflicts, let's say. And Bavinck calls this the speculative method. You've already talked about it to some degree. The idea here is the dominance and the autonomy of the subject. And among adherents and proponents of this speculative process is the idea that supernaturalism has been destroyed. Rousseau and Kant, Lessing and Schleiermacher, Bavinck points out, those professors and the schools of philosophical thought that largely followed in their wake was filled with people who had this idea that humankind had progress into a higher understanding of rationality. And in that rationality, they had come to understand the even clearer truth that supernaturalism failed. You know, when you look and take that cold, hard look at what is, you see only the world you experience. And so this leads to this dominance and autonomy of the subject, you know, this subjectivism and even objective forms of subjectivism. For example, modern phenomenalism. And people might say, what are you talking about? What does that mean? Well, you can see this most strongly in people who have this central idea that science is the best and highest way for understanding and explaining the universe. And part of the allure of this approach, Chuck, is not that we Christians have a different position. It's not that we're saying, oh, no, science is not a good way to understand the universe. I think the issue comes down to science is a great way to understand the universe if one does so scientifically. And what does that mean? If you understand that scientific conclusions are conditioned by the observer making the observations. Now, in classic sciences, Chuck, that's not so bad. You know, you get your lab coat on and you go down to the chemistry lab and you do some experiments and you fiddle with the dials on a couple of machines and you run different trials, and eventually you come to the conclusion that the atomic number of an element is a certain value, and then you write up your notes and publish a paper. I read your paper and go down and put on my lab coat, and I run your experiments on my equipment, and I come to the same result. Well, that's awesome. Who could object to that? And the answer is that physics and science, in this sense, in the broader sense, is always a subset of metaphysics. That is to say, reality, the universe, always larger than what we can demonstrate about it, what we can analytically prove about it. And when that comes into play, and you start to listen to what people say are scientific truths about reality, then we start to see that there are lots of people using the good name of science to actually make dogmatic conclusions, to make conclusions about reality that are affected by their own worldview. And indeed, in some sense, we even understand that humans can never on their own exceed that. So my worldview, unless I am aided by someone outside of myself, my worldview can never exceed the boundaries of my own observation, of my own self, my own ability to rationally put the pieces together. And so in the age of the Industrial Revolution, in the age of the scientific Geisteswissenschaften, you know, the excitement of the discovery that science in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the explosion of excitement that people found when they realized so much more of the world could be analyzed than had been previously imagined. There was this buoyant optimism, just like there was a buoyant optimism, remember Harnack talking about in that quote, early Christians went out and participated in the marketplace of ideas and won because they built out supporting structures that won in the marketplace of ideas. And so, too, in this second successive method, the speculative method, we have this turn to pure reason, to pure rationality in some sense, or in another sense, pure romanticism, this dominance and autonomy of the subject itself. And so, Chuck, means of answering questions about reality stopped being, what does the Bible say? And started being, let me look inside of myself for the answer. So, Chuck, here I am, and I'm deciding, what is a woman? And in times past, it was very common, indeed, almost universally accepted that a woman was defined by this Christian worldview. The Bible gave us information. In the beginning, God created humankind, male and female, created he, them. And so there was this ontological underpinning. But now, in light of this speculative method, this turn to the subject, there's this idea. Maybe I can look inside of myself to find an even truer answer. And so with that in mind, we start to see how proponents of schools have not only changed, let's say, the course of secularism in the West, but have also changed Christianity. How many Christians nowadays are practically members of this school while still seeking to maintain some semblance of their Christianity? And when you and I were reading the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology, we really came across this in a strong way. You and I have, from our Reformed school, this idea of sola scriptura. The Bible is the ultimate authority, and its testimony is what counts the most in understanding theological issues. But in the Oxford Handbook, we saw that Scripture, while an important source, maybe even a primary source, was not the ultimate source, and nor was it the only primary source. And so you saw other appeals to other sources for what constituted legitimate, valid revelation. So this speculative method is much more recent. I love Bavinck's idea of, let me back off for just a second. What happened when these steps started to be taken? Well, Bavinck talks about a climactic event early in the history of this triumph of reason, this speculative step. And it was the French Revolution. No gods, no masters. That was one of the rallying cries. And why would people cry? No gods and no masters. Well, they thought they had something better. And so had in the aftermath of the French Revolution, had there not been a mitigating thinker to rethink this speculative concept, perhaps the speculative method would have been gone out of vogue much sooner. But Bavinck here talks about Hegel and the triumph of reason. And so this restoration, Bavinck calls him a philosophical interpreter of this restoration. And so under Hegelianism and similar Hegelian schools of thought, Bavinck says that theology and philosophy were reconciled. Faith was transformed by speculative reason into absolute knowledge. Now, that goes right back to this idea of the dialectic. Chuck, you and I used to have a certain understanding of the world, but since then, we've been taking dialectic steps that are justified from our own experience and our own consciousness and our own scientific understanding. And now because of that, we've moved, and many have even got to the place where they thought faith was now superseded. So we had something better than faith. We have speculative reason that has turned into absolute knowledge. And there were even many who wanted to still be Christians, who wanted to take these dialectic steps. And so this speculative method really has run an amazing course in Western history. Now, and in some sense, it still is running that Western course. If you think about the scientific method, if you also think about some of the early ideas of liberalism, and I don't simply just mean liberalism in the theological sense, such as, for example, Schleiermacher, but this whole idea of the liberal person, the post-supernatural believer, and some of the ideas of liberal democracy that are invoked today, for example, are based on or a part of the developments from this speculative method. And so Bavinck goes into other issues here relating to that, especially he talks about the mediating theology. And so you have this idea that in the consciousness, the faith, the confession of the church, and you link it with this rationalistic speculative method of Hegel, you have independent rational insight. And that's one of the reasons, Chuck, why someone who has really bought into this school is difficult to proselytize. Who wants steak? Who wants hamburger when you have steak? And in many people's mind, independent rational insight, so much better than the older Christian ideas of dogmatic faith. So that's the second school, Chuck. How does that strike you, and how are we building here through Bavinck's portion of the chapter?
You know, I really appreciate here that Bavinck once again recognizes both the strengths and the weaknesses of this method. Now, he's clearly more critical of this method than he is of the first, but he also recognizes that some of the reason for this speculative method and why people have moved into that method are out of some impetuses that were necessary, right? He pointed out that Hegel and Schleiermacher both understood that religion has a place of its own in human life. When I read that line, I almost thought of, Bavinck didn't put it this way, and neither Hegel nor Schleiermacher ever did, and I'm not sure they ever would have. But there's a sense in which you can see here this idea that for Hegel and for Schleiermacher, there is at least a recognition that there is a sphere for religion, that there is a part of life in which religion belongs, that we don't, as pure rationalism can sometimes do, it just puts paid to the idea that there is anything valuable about religion. And Hegel and Schleiermacher understood that there is a place for religion, that it's a unique phenomenon, and therefore requires a uniquely appropriate organ in human nature. And so I found that to be helpful. He also points out that Hegel and Schleiermacher they put that in somewhat different ways. They start with maybe they start with this subjective starting point, but then where they take that position and what it comes out with Hegel, it's more about reason. With Schleiermacher, it's about feeling. And again, these, I think this gets to some of the battles even in the secular world of philosophy today as to how do we think about things. And we see that there is a sense in which sort of a Schleiermachian idea that feelings are at the apex of how we need to think about ourselves. We see how powerful that idea has become, and yet there are also those who are more Hegelian in their thoughts and really talk about the mind and reason being sort of the basis, the starting point from where we do this thinking. But of course, Bavinck then recognizes that the real weakness, as you've very well pointed out to this, is that suddenly what we've done is we've made the individual, we've made ourselves the king of it all, and we're unwilling to recognize the importance of the creator. In fact, we lose the idea that we are creatures, and we put ourselves at the we give ourselves sort of the crown over creation in a way that belongs to God. And so this, I just found this section to be really good on that point. And then there was one other piece, I think, here that is really important. And I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but I think this piece also is going to carry into, and maybe next time we'll talk about these other methods. But I think this theme that Bavinck begins here carries itself through some of these other themes. And this is this idea about how do thinking and being correspond with each other. And Bavinck points out that Hegel and Schleiermacher were not content with the idea that thinking and being correspond with each other. There's some strength there that they understand the need for thinking and being to correspond to each other, but he says they're not content with that, and instead they equate the two. And Bavinck says this equation of thinking and being is the basic error of speculative philosophy. And so this is the primary criticism here, this idea that we can take thinking and being and equate them as one thing, so that the entire world can be summed up into our thoughts really become the reality, the I think therefore I am idea of Descartes, or Fichte's view of a rational principle of its own whose essence involves existence. And that came from Spinoza as well. These are all concerns that in the end, we as Christians then, when we look at this speculative method, we recognize this is a real weakness here and something that we need to avoid. And despite Bavinck saying some good things about the basis for where Hegel begins to move, he says Hegel's philosophy, therefore, was not as harmless as it originally seemed to be. It was the working out of Fichte's thesis that the ego posits the non-ego, that the subject creates the object, and that at that point we lose any sense of objective reality, that everything really becomes subjective, and that's the real weakness of this particular method. And so I found that idea, and especially as we get into these other methods, I think is a key point to keep in mind as we discuss these things. I think we probably aren't going to be able to get to the other methods, but is there anything that you want to add to what I've said, either about, this speculative method, or how maybe we can think about some of the ideas that Bavinck has brought up in these first two methods, and how we might apply them as we perhaps next time get into some of these other methods that Bavinck talks about?
Chuck, I think what makes these methods easier to understand conceptually is not only a consideration of these technical details. What did Kant say about this? What did Schleiermacher say about that? Though obviously very important and relevant. But what helps me is when I remember that there are people behind these methods and these schools of thought. And when a person starts to see, hey, I remember Professor so-and-so, he reminds me of the kind of person who made those arguments, then it becomes real, and the abstractions will hang on the bone, so to speak, in the sense that they become real people that you can relate to. And I think that's what we'll do to build on this and then go into the other two schools in our next discussion session.